Welcome to a significant event for the Baltimore community in regards to addressing the topic of abuse. I look around, I see many familiar faces. Better yet, I see many unfamiliar faces. So that means more people are joining, which is great. My name is Shmuel Fischler, and it is a privilege for me to have taken part in developing tonight's event. I am the Director of Outreach and Advocacy for CHANA, an instrumental and resourceful local organization that provides multiple services for survivors of all forms of abuse. The spectrum of our services ranges from prevention and education, such as a night like this, to crisis management and support after the fact. I encourage you all to connect with CHANA and learn more about what we offer. I'd like to take a moment to thank Rabbi Hauer and B'nai Jacob Shari Zion for hosting us this evening and being supportive of all that we do. So people ask me all the time what it's like to have the position that I have. And I never really had a great answer. And so leading up to tonight, I thought more about it and tried to put it into some words. What I came up with is that it's a combination of humbling, bittersweet, and an inspiring experience all rolled up into one. Let me explain. I think it's humbling and bitter because I am a long, long way from the idealistic young man I was, although I look really young, hoping and believing that the world is filled with only good. Unfortunately, I've been forced to move beyond that. I think all of us have, to our own degrees, moved beyond that. Everyone in this room, and everyone who's going to be watching this video, has a keen awareness that abuse is a universal problem. I have also learned to intentionally focus on what is good. There is a sweetness and inspiration that keeps me going. There are people, both community members and leaders, who work tirelessly with energy and conviction on the issue of abuse. It's not an easy or a simple task. It is inspiring for me to watch those who keep pushing us forward. Most inspiring for me, though, are the survivors. The strength, the bravery, and the growth that comes out of suffering and pain is truly inspirational, and I applaud their resilience. Before we frame the intentions for this evening and introduce our speakers, there are a few more things that we need to share. This night would not be possible without the help and support of many colleagues and allies, many of whom are in this crowd tonight. A number of individual rabbanim have been instrumental in developing this program and supporting this work. In addition, there have been several shuls and individuals that have been generous in sponsoring today's events. If you look at on the rear side of their agenda, there's a list of the wonderful sponsors for today. We also must acknowledge that for a night such as this to happen, we have to stand on the shoulders of those who preceded us. Every progression and every step we make in addressing this issue is in part due to the work of previous individuals and organizations who at the time may not have seen the fruits of their labor. And finally, a thank you to all of you who have felt the responsibility to come out on a night when I'm sure you could have rationalized using the time for something else. It also takes an acceptance of vulnerability and perhaps some discomfort to come out and discuss the topic of abuse in our community publicly. So I thank you. Earlier today, we had a meaningful and open dialogue with local rabbanim, close to 3 hours, with the same panel that you see here. And today was and is another installment in a series of programs that have occurred already and that are being planned to address abuse that occurs in our community. One of those programs is the Safety Kit program. We have with us Ms. Debbie Fox, who founded the program. A bit over a year ago, CHANA and other local organizations were fortunate enough to bring Ms. Fox in and the Safety Kit program to Baltimore. As most of you are aware, this program is a child abuse prevention program that utilizes the partnerships of volunteers, mental health professionals, school administration, school staff, parents, and the children themselves from K through 5th to prevent and address child abuse. So I want to take a moment to give you an update on what we've managed to accomplish so far in just a bit over a year, which is just fantastic. So we've had 7 schools signed up as partners in Safety Kit. Administrations from 5 of those schools completed a roundtable discussion about their school's culture and plan regarding abuse. We've had 19 volunteers in 2 separate rounds trained to bring the Safety Kit material into the classrooms. We've had 9 mental health professionals, local professionals, that volunteered to be part of the program and have since facilitated school trainings. Almost 200 staff members from 4 schools completed a 2-hour training that provided education and dialogue around all forms of abuse, of child abuse. And to date, we're close to 5,000 children, some of them already on their second round, from preschool through 5th grade, from 7 schools that have had the A, B, C, D, and some of them E, Rules of Safety Kit brought into their classrooms and brought home packets to share and review with their parents, which is a phenomenal accomplishment. Last year, we had close to 800 parents representing 6 schools attend a 2-hour workshop discussing the forms of abuse, signs to look for, tips for prevention, and handling disclosures from children. We have another additional school that's committed for next year. And I invite you that if you are interested in what your child's school has done, to go to them directly and ask them and inquire and discuss with them what they have done from the Safety Kit program. And our hope and our goal is that in the coming years to expand that to be able to bring it to older grades beyond 5th grade as well. We have also hosted the Boy to Mensch program last year, which worked on developing the relationship skills of young men so that as they grow, they continue to have healthy relationships. Aside from these programs, I would like to share another program that is coming. There are cards on many of the chairs that have some of the details. There's a save the date. And this program is specifically geared towards parents of children who have already experienced some form of trauma or abuse. And it will focus on how to adapt their parenting under such circumstances. There will be a community seminar in September, and then there will be several groups for parents who are interested after that. You can watch out for more details, or you're welcome to contact CHANA in the coming months to find out more. There's another important disclaimer before we go forward, and that is, statistically speaking, and anecdotally as well, there are probably a number of people in this room who have had their own experience with some form of trauma or abuse, or someone close to them has a story or an experience with some form of abuse. So talking tonight, we should be mindful that as we continue and some of the speakers share, it's possible that it could be triggering for you or them. And I just want to put that out there and be mindful that everyone should take care of themselves if they need to step out, if it's overwhelming. It's not our intention to overwhelm anybody, but if that were to be the case, please make sure to take care of yourself. So now we're fortunate to have 3 wonderful individuals who can probably, they're all experts in what they do, and they can each probably take up the entire evening. And we've asked them to somehow try to pare it down into and share the whole evening. So we're asking them to share the lessons they've learned, educate us, and provide us with practical applications to help develop our roles in dealing with abuse. You have I can stand here for 10 minutes telling their bios and their experience. You have it in front of you. We have Ms. Lisa Ferentz, who's a local resource. She has an institute that helps train clinicians in trauma. I've been there myself. It's fantastic. And she travels around the world speaking on the topic of trauma. We have Ms. Debbie Fox from Los Angeles, who many of you know, and is the founder of the Magen Yeladim Safety Kit program. And we have Dr. David Pelkowitz from New York, who also travels internationally speaking on the topic of trauma and abuse and is a professor as well. So I would have a hard time believing that anyone in this room is naive enough to think that our community is immune to the problem of abuse. Whether it's domestic abuse, child abuse, or the abuse of our elders, we are all in this room because we recognize that abuse does not discriminate between communities. Additionally, anyone in a leadership or rabbinical position, as we learned today and talked about earlier today, is far too familiar with the issue of abuse. That awareness alone, though, does not make it any less complex of an issue. There's no one magic answer to this problem. Tonight is not going to make it go away, and it requires ongoing work. There's no denying that we as a community can continue to improve how we handle abuse, whether our involvement comes before, during, or after. Let's look at tonight as an investment in the building of a better informed, better educated, better prepared community that is willing to respond to situations of abuse and addressing both the victim and the perpetrator. We live in an imperfect world. That's just a fact. What we do about it, however, is up to us. As they say, talk is cheap. Our hope tonight is to start facilitating the bridge from talk to application. And one final thought before we move on to who you're really here for. In the animal kingdom, there's a really interesting phenomenon which struck me as relevant for tonight. And it happens among fire ants. When they're faced with rising waters or a river, what actually happens is they're able to latch together their legs and create either a floating raft or sometimes a bridge even to get to dry land. It's really fascinating to watch. If you want to, you can pull up a video very easily. So a tiny insect, when working together as a group, can accomplish something that each on their own would never be able to do. So the goal of tonight is to do just that. As the title of tonight's event suggests, it takes a village. It is to unite us, to empower us, to hold ourselves responsible in our appropriate roles so that we can address, mitigate, and, Be'ezus Hashem, prevent the scale of abuse in our community. So thank you again for being here, and I will turn it over to Ms. Lisa Ferens.
Thank you. Good evening. It's a great pleasure to be here with all of you. So I've been in private practice for almost 34 years now, and I have tried to be as compassionate a witness as I can be to profound and very moving narratives of children, teenagers, and adults who've experienced every conceivable kind of trauma, abuse, neglect that you can unfortunately potentially imagine and think of. And they find this extraordinary courage when they do come into mental health resources and into a therapist's office. They bring with them, I think, extraordinary resiliency and hope and the belief that if their stories can be witnessed and believed, if they can feel seen, if their pain can be validated, then they can begin to heal. So what I want to do is, Shmuel had asked me to talk about the impact of trauma, and what I really want to do is show you the impact of trauma by empowering all of the very brave clients I've worked with over the years to allow them to show you the impact and the toll that trauma takes through their artwork. Those of us who work with trauma in this day and age know that you can't just talk about it. It's important to be able to talk about it for sure, but trauma is not really stored in the part of our brains that has to do with language and words. Trauma is stored visually, and that's why so many people are plagued by flashbacks years and years after they've been abused. And trauma is also stored on the body, somatically. And so many, many survivors for years and years travel through life with tremendous physical pain. It's as if their bodies are holding the memories and the stories of what's happened to them. So I'm going to invite you to view their art from your most compassionate parts and to just echo what Shmuel said, and that is to do what you need to do to take care of yourselves as you sort of become compassionate witnesses to the impact that trauma has. So this was drawn by a 15-year-old, and it speaks to the chaos that she not only feels inside of her, but that she also lives with or lived with every day in her family. Her sister, who was several years older than her, was a heroin addict. And the family would always go into this extraordinary state of disequilibrium and crisis whenever her sister would relapse and use again. And the 15-year-old, in response to that, felt very invisible in her family, understandably so, because everything sort of revolved around the addiction. So first I want to point out that's a trauma in and of itself, to have a sibling who is struggling, and then to have parents who have to sort of summon all of their resources and their focus and their energy. And often other kids do feel neglected and invisible and left behind. And because she felt neglected and invisible, she tried to communicate her pain through the form of an eating disorder. She became anorexic and was literally starving her body. And this was a form of communication that said, I don't feel seen, I don't feel nurtured, I don't feel valued in my family. So this is the chaos, both inside of her and outside of her. This is the rage that a male client I've worked with for years felt in response to having been chronically sexually abused, tried to tell several people in his world about his abuse, and unfortunately, as is often the case, was not believed. Not only was he not believed, he was actually further traumatized when he was told that what happened wasn't a big deal and that he should just basically get over it and move on with his life. All trauma survivors need to do something with what they feel inside of them, particularly when they're not being acknowledged or validated, and they're not being given opportunities to process and to heal the trauma that they've experienced and that they hold. And so what many trauma survivors do is they begin to try to self-medicate and be numb and self-soothe and keep sort of repressing back down all those awful memories each time they start to bubble up. So his response to being sexually traumatized was to begin to cut his own body. This piece of art was actually a very big step forward in his healing because I helped him to be able to transfer the rage that he was displaying on his own skin onto the paper instead. But I think you can still get the feeling for the rage that this man held and carried for many, many years of his life before he got the support that he deserved. This is a woman who had been repeatedly sexually abused and verbally and psychologically abused by a rabbi who was a beloved family member. And this is part of why it becomes so painful and difficult when the perpetrator is somebody who is often so well respected and well liked, and it makes the credibility of the disclosure even more challenging and less believable. And so this is a woman who spent years torturing her body through acts of self-mutilation. She also developed a very serious drinking problem and at different times took on eating disordered behavior. This speaks to just that intense feeling of depression and anxiety that lived inside of her until she got the help that she deserved. This is a piece of art drawn by an adult who's married to an alcoholic and also grew up in a family with an alcoholic father. Unfortunately, 85% of women who grew up with an alcoholic marry an alcoholic. And this speaks to the turmoil that she lives with and the idea of having to walk on eggshells, which is extraordinarily draining mentally and physically and psychologically. And this is a piece of art that I often ask my clients to draw, which is show me what it felt like to live in your house. And one thing I just want to point out as a caveat is that in all of these cases, none of these trauma survivors had words to articulate their pain and their struggle. And it was through the expression of art that really became the entryway into being able to attach a verbal narrative to their experiences. So this was a woman who for years and years kept saying to me, it was really bad in my house, but I can't explain how, and I can't explain why. It just was. And in those situations, I know that I have a lot of incredibly savvy therapists in the audience who know that when we're confronted with that, rather than continuing to push the client to use words, we shift to other mediums. We shift to more right brain-based expressive mediums like art. And so this is what it felt like growing up in her house. And what I want to point out to you about this image, if you notice, there's no doorknob, and the window is out of reach. And this is powerful information about her feeling trapped. You see that because she's literally in the corner, right? And her arms are up in that sort of classic image that we get in the artwork of trauma survivors, which is an image of surrender and helplessness and a plea to be rescued. So she's showing us that she feels completely alone in her family, although she had many siblings. And she feels that it's impossible for her to escape, and it's impossible for anybody to rescue her. So when she was about 13, 14, she discovered that one way she could escape was by getting high every day. And this was done by a male client. I do want to reiterate that for the 34 years of my private practice, my caseload has almost always been 50% male. I think sometimes there's a belief in, not just in our community, but in society at large, that it's women who are predominantly victimized, and I'm here to tell you that's absolutely not the case. I've worked with just as many men in my 34 years as a therapist. So this is called the well of despair. And this is what it felt like for him to grow up in his family. He was raised by a father who was an alcoholic and who was extraordinarily physically abusive and violent. The other thing I want to point out in families where there's abuse is it's not only about the perpetrator, it's often about the other parent, who for many reasons is what we call the non-protective bystander. And so there's almost this double experience of betrayal and trauma when not only you are being harmed or violated by somebody that you trust and somebody who should be loving and safe, but often the other parent is not doing anything to stop that abuse in any meaningful kind of way. The two images I want you to notice in this piece of art that are very universal and iconic for trauma survivors are first the broken heart. And this is a very common image because so many people who are violated by people they trust, which is overwhelmingly who their perpetrators are, people they know and people they trust, they do draw these kinds of images of hearts that are broken, hearts that have daggers in them, hearts that are crossed out, hearts that are dripping blood, and all of that is a way to communicate this profound feeling of caretaker betrayal. The other image I want to call to your attention is the eye. This is something that trauma survivors will frequently just doodle in their artwork, and it speaks to their own need to be hypervigilant, to always be watching, and to be reading the emotional temperature of what's going on in the family in an attempt to try to stay half a step ahead of the abuse that might inevitably follow. It's also representative of feeling watched, because one of the things that so many victims experience is this sense of violation of privacy and boundaries. Let's see. I don't know why it froze. Maybe we can just do it. Thank you, Shmuel. I appreciate that. So another technique that a lot of us in the field of trauma use is inviting our clients to draw self-portraits. And that's incredibly helpful because it helps us as therapists to understand how somebody who's been traumatized actually perceives themselves. So it's not unusual to have somebody who's in their 30s, 40s, 50s. My oldest client is 76 years old. And although they're chronologically adults, the way they see themselves is often frozen in time. It's young, it's powerless, it's disempowered. And so when I invite them to do a self-portrait, I'm able to get a read on how they perceive themselves. And the way that we perceive ourselves obviously is going to profoundly impact our thoughts, our feelings, and all of the behavioral choices that we make in our lives. So this is a piece of art that was actually done by a woman who was sexually abused by the family priest. I do work with clergy abuse, not just rabbis, but priests as well. And if any of you have watched the Netflix documentary, The Keepers, about Father Maskell and the hundreds of girls that he sexually molested in a Catholic school, this is one of the survivors of his rampage of abuse. So here's a woman who's in her late 30s, but look at how she depicts herself. She's very small, she's very young. She's actually the age of when the abuse began. And you see that she's in the fetal position because she's desperately trying to keep her body protected and safe. And it's very normal for trauma survivors to go through life incredibly guarded. They shield their hearts, they shield their bodies. Women who are married who have not resolved their sexual abuse will delay going to the mikveh. They won't want to be sexually active with their partners because becoming sexually active often evokes flashback experiences. So she sees herself as really young. She's surrounded by darkness, which is indicative of the dissociation. Dissociation is a very common coping strategy that trauma survivors use. It's mentally escaping when you can't literally physically escape. And unfortunately, not only do trauma survivors dissociate when they're experiencing abuse, they continue to dissociate, which means they continue to go through life in this fundamentally disempowered and helpless, sort of deer in the headlights state. What I really want to call your attention to about this extraordinary piece of art is the juxtaposition between the way she's depicted herself and the imagery that you see on this side of the art, which is bright sunshine and flowers and blue sky. And this is her way of communicating her family's denial about what this priest was doing to her, and never feeling believed and feeling completely alone in her abuse. So when we talk about the impact of trauma, we're not just talking about the actual horrible acts that people have to endure. We also have to look at what happens when they disclose. Are they believed? Are they not believed? Because that's going to add layers of additional trauma. This is another self-portrait about how this adult feels inside, and this speaks to her depression, and again, her feeling of being infantilized and very young and very helpless. This has a very interesting, quick little backstory. When I invited this client, and these are all different clients, when I invited this client to do a self-portrait, and I usually have lots of different colors and lots of different medium, and she said, "You don't have the color that I need to do my self-portrait." And I was kind of perplexed because there were many, many colors in front of her. And I said, "Well, what color do you need?" And she said, "Invisible." So you see, there's no face, there's no body features. I know it's a little bit hard to see here, but these are also broken hearts that she painted all around her body. This client chose to do a collage of her self-portrait, and it's a defeated boxer. And then she wrote, "You're damaged goods now." Trauma survivors unfortunately go through life defining themselves by what happened to them. So rather than saying something bad happened, they go through life saying, "I am bad." And this is a woman who was repeatedly violated, and rather than putting the shame and the blame on her abuser, she took on that responsibility, which unfortunately most survivors do until they get into therapy and learn that what happened was in no way their fault. So this is why she felt damaged. And here's a collage that I think is very indicative of how so many survivors feel, and the title of this is Shame. And so covering the face is something that a lot of survivors draw and also kind of do as they go through their daily lives, because they don't want you to see them. They don't want you to get close to them because they believe that you will judge them in the ways that they judge themselves. So when trauma is not addressed and it's not validated, here's what it can lead to. This is a client who for years cut on her body. Many, many survivors, male and female, who've been physically and sexually abused, punish their own bodies, hold their own bodies responsible. So this was a woman who was forced to do sexual acts with her hand, which is very, very common. And rather than, again, putting the blame on her abuser, she blamed her hand. Well, if you hate your hand or you hate a part of your body, it resonates to hurt that part of your body. And so for years, she was cutting on her fingers and cutting on her wrist. This is a client who, using clay, depicted her anorexic behavior. Again, profoundly emotionally neglected. I really want to emphasize that neglect is just as traumatic as other forms of trauma are. And here you see that giant heart again that's representative of feeling heartbroken and not having gotten the nurturance and the validation and the compassion that she needed and deserved. So here's another self-portrait that I think speaks volumes to the impact that her sexual molestation had on her. Her entire sense of herself is that she is nothing more than an object to be sexualized. Her father taught her that in order to be accepted and loved and approved of, you have to do something sexual. So this was a woman who in her 20s and 30s developed a very serious sexual addiction, really playing Russian roulette with her body, having a lot of unprotected, unsafe sex with strangers. And here's a client who very poignantly depicts the impact of her trauma by choosing two images of children and putting padlocks over their bodies. Because again, it's about not wanting anybody to touch her body or be close to her body. When you're traumatized, one of the mantras that you go through life with is getting close equals getting hurt. And this is an extraordinary piece of art. I want to use the pointer so that you don't miss it. What this person did was she took several images of herself as a little girl. Here, here, here. You see all those images? This is a girl who was profoundly abused sexually by her father as well as her mother as well as her two brothers, and went on to survive that by doing what many people do, and that is she developed what used to be called multiple personalities, or what we now call dissociative identity disorder. And each one of those alter personalities are hiding behind the tree in order to be safe. And here's something that I know will resonate for everybody in this room, and that is trauma robs people of a lot of things, and one of the most basic things that it can rob people of is their sense of spirituality. Many clients go through life saying, "Where was God when I was being abused?" And there are countless people who have given up their spiritual lives, religious rituals that used to bring them comfort. And as we talked about this afternoon, going off the derech is not something that feels good to them. But they do feel so betrayed by God. And this is an example of where was God and how her faith has been so shaken. So, I want to leave you on a positive note because I know this is really hard and really heavy, and I feel how present you are, and I feel how much you care about this. I want you to know that people heal, and I've had the extraordinary privilege in the past 34 years of not only being a witness to people's pain, but really being a witness to their healing process. So when we collectively, as a community, as a religious community, when we just as family members, as friends, as teachers, as siblings, when we acknowledge and validate the pain that people come to us with and let them know that we believe their pain is real, that's when healing can begin. So I want to close with images that show you that healing is possible. And I also want you to know that I deliberately showed you the artwork of clients who have healed. So every image that you witnessed, as painful and difficult as that was, the wonderful good news is that every one of those people have in fact healed. They're better parents, they're better partners, they've given up their self-destructive behaviors, they're reclaiming their spiritual lives, and they're moving forward and paying it forward, which is what healed trauma survivors get to do. They get to inspire other people and pay it forward. So here's a collage that speaks to taking it one day at a time and knowing that you are more than your trauma. And I want to close with a trifold piece of art that a very extraordinary woman who I worked with for close to 28 years presented to me as a gift when she ended her therapy with me. So I want you to imagine a big picture frame that has 3 sections to it. This is the top section. It's a caterpillar that's covered in question marks because she had no idea who she was. She had no idea why she did all of the extraordinarily self-destructive things that she did. She had no idea why she couldn't love and embrace her children, why she didn't want anything in terms of intimacy to do with her husband. So that's how she started the process of therapy. The second image represents the therapeutic process, which if you know anything about caterpillars in a chrysalis, there's this extraordinary struggle that takes place inside that chrysalis so that the work can unfold. And then when she finished her therapy, this was her sense of herself. Fully healed and fully willing and able to make a difference in the world and pay it forward. Thank you all for your kind attention.
Thank you. Let me start with two images of healing and resilience. I mean, this talk is going to be a little bit about prevention, and then My close colleague, Debbie Fox, is going to talk about specific ways of talking to your kids. You know, the Hebrew word tikva, the Hebrew word for hope, is tied to the word kav, a rope, a cord, meaning that we're always tied together, and it's connection, the theory of tonight, that is really the source of hope, the source of resilience. Thought number one is I have a close colleague who I've done some research studies for. He's a very famous expert in trauma. His name is Bessel van der Kolk. He's a world-famous person, very enthusiastic about trauma and trying to help people who are traumatized. And he's a little bit of a meshugalo sadavar. He's totally obsessed with trying to help traumatized people. And a little after 9/11, we were collaborating together on some research articles. And he comes running into my office, and he's all excited. He has a picture of an fMRI of one of his patients. It was a patient who was caught in the stairwell of the World Trade Center on 9/11. And he was having a flashback. So he showed me, what does a person's brain look like at the moment that he's having a flashback to the worst moment of his life? Literally, the World Trade Center is crumbling around him, and he barely got away with his life. And when you look at it, the first words that flash through my mind is two words, Vayidom Aharon, two words to describe how Aaron felt when he heard the horrible news about the sudden death of his two sons. The Barbanel, among other Mefarshim, asked, why the word Demimut? Why Vayidom? And he says, because when you think you have the answer and you choose not to share it, then the word is sheket, vayishkod Aaron. How is demama different than sheket? Demama is for when you're literally rendered speechless. Somehow you're beyond words. And that's what you saw here. When I looked at this fMRI, I saw that this man's brain, the language centers of his brain, were literally shut down. Literally shut down. But here's where it becomes the kav. Here's where the tikva comes in. As Dr. van der Kolk, in subsequent months, showed me the fMRIs, the brain scans of this man, as he was healing, as he was given a sense of safety and words for his pain, words of resilience, words of healing, which is what we do with survivors of abuse all the time. We give them words, we make them feel safe, we let them know you're not alone, we're with you. As that happened, as Brokaw's area, the language centers of the brain lit up, that's where healing came. And gradually, through this naming of the monster, this man gradually, totally came from helpless victim to victorious survivor. That's story number one. Story number two, before I get into some more specifics, because I also want to talk about hope, is another story of resilience. For some reason, I had forgotten this for many years, but recently I came across a news article that the woman who this story about, after a long, wonderful life, just very recently had died. Listen to this story. The woman's name was Sadie Hofstein. During the years leading up to World War II, she was this incredibly successful, charismatic woman. I was very lucky. I came to know her very well. We worked closely together when she was the head of Nassau County Mental Health, and she'd frequently ask me to come and work with her on programs and to do some speaking for her. You couldn't say no to Sadie. She would never take no for an answer. In the late 30s, she had training. She had become an actress. She was an unusually talented actress, and she was beginning to make a name for herself. But she wanted more for herself. And she trained as a child therapist under Anna Freud, the daughter of Sigmund Freud. So she was a dual threat. She was both an actress and very respected as an actress, but she also was a child therapist, a child analyst. Very interesting combination. World War II starts, and she becomes an officer in the British Army. In 1945, Bergen-Belsen was liberated. I think it was Bergen-Belsen. I think also 83 children survived. And the word came out that there was a fight between the British and I think the Russians about who was going to take responsibility for these 83 survivors of the camp. But until that time, it was agreed that the British would be in charge. And Sadie started driving her commanding officer crazy, saying, "Ki lekach no tsarti." I was born in order to be the house mother for these children. They needed a house mother to watch these children. And they said, "No, we're not so sure. We need you for other things." And she drove them crazy. I learned over the years, you can't say no to Sadie. If she wanted something, you had to say yes. She had a way of pushing, and she made incredible things happen in the incredibly meaningful life that she had. So they finally give in. And after the horrible years of suffering of these children, she takes over as their house mother, and she was incredibly charismatic, incredibly warm, incredibly kind. And the kids, understandably, totally fell in love with her. Totally fell in love with her. After those horrible years of nobody even giving them crumbs of love and affection, Sadie gave them everything they were thirsty for. And she found the right balance between love and limits. Towards the end of the military presence in that part of the former camp, they decided finally to send the American and British soldiers home. But to see them off, there was going to be a huge USO show. Entertainment. Bob Hope, Jack Benny, the leading entertainers of the world were coming. And who do they put in charge of the show? Sadie. She was great in organizational things. She had a background, and they put her in charge. And all of the children of Bergen-Belsen go to her and say, "Sadie, we're so proud of you. Can you get us good seats?" She says to them, "The show is not appropriate for kids your age. It's not going to start till 9 o'clock at night, way past your bedtime. You will not go to the show." And they drove her crazy. They said, "Please, please, we're so proud of you. We have to see the show." And like a good mother, she said no. She knew how to find the balance between love and limits. There was incredible security then because there were still Nazi stragglers picking people off. There were snipers. It was very dangerous. So the show had thousands and thousands of troops, incredible security guarding the entrance to the show. Incredibly tough security. And Sadie comes to introduce the first entertainer. I think it was Bob Hope. And there, the front 3 rows are the 83 children of Bergen-Belsen screaming, "Sadie, Sadie," with pride. And she was furious. She kills the mic. She goes down to these kids, and she says, "Tell me who let you in here. He's a dead man." And the kids all laughed, and they said, "Sadie, you don't think we were able to get through the last 3-4 years in Bergen-Belsen surviving, and we can't get past American and British security? Come on, Sadie." Resilience is built in to kids' lives. Here's the main point I want to make in the time that's been given to me. The main point goes like this, and all the research on abuse prevention, because believe me, effective prevention is there. You're going to get the words in a few minutes from the master in this area. But here's one of the main points the research finds. If when you leave here tonight, you're so nervous about your kids being in danger, it's going to cripple you. It will undermine your ability to protect your children. If you're not nervous at all, that's not good either. You want to find the right balance between small amounts of manageable anxiety and understanding this is in your hands. It's in your hands. A couple of conversations with your kids and it going from an event to a process, letting them know that there are times that if adults do things that make you a little bit uncomfortable, you have a right to tell them in a way that's not chutzpahdik, but you have a right to tell them. It doesn't take many discussions to get that message over to your kids. Here's the key. You have to do it in the context of the same way you talk to your kids about any kind of safety. Just like you talk to your kids about fire safety around Hanukkah time, water safety in the summertime, or how to cross the street when they hit an age that they have to learn how to look both ways before crossing the street. Same way that you do that, you talk to your kids about safety, that nobody has the right to touch you in certain parts of your body that makes you feel uncomfortable. Debbie's going to go through details about the actual script. But the key is to name the monster. The key is to be able to talk to them so they don't feel hopeless and helpless when it happens. Just by giving them the words, just by lighting up the language centers of the brain and telling them if anybody touches you in a way that makes you feel inappropriate, you should go and tell. It really makes a difference. You know, a number of years ago, there was a sniper shooting in 1991 on a playground in Los Angeles. Fortunately, a number of kids were killed. There were two 9-year-old kids pinned by the crossfire, exactly the same level of proximity to the shooter. They were in equal levels of danger. One was totally fine. The other was totally a mess. So a famous researcher at UCLA, Dr. Bob Pinos, interviewed the kids, trying to find out why would one kid be resilient and the other kid isn't. And the answer of the kid who's resilient gets at the key to what tonight's about. The kid who was resilient, Dr. Pino says, hey, you seem to be doing fine, but you know, it was a pretty traumatic thing, you know? It's a little dangerous. There was a shooter and you lost some friends. And the kid said, oh, that, I'm fine. He says, you know, last week there was a program in my community about earthquake safety, earthquake planning. And they told me, if there's an earthquake, here's what to do. You dive for cover, you find a place to hide yourself, and you'll be fine. So when the shooting started, I said to myself, this is a little bit like an earthquake. And I knew exactly what to do, and I knew I'd be fine. Now, this kid was no safer than the kid next to him. But he believed he was safer. We can't always protect our kids. We can't stop them from the possibility that sometimes there might be somebody who inappropriately touches them. But I have news for you. Every research study I've ever seen on abuse prevention shows that if somebody in a one-shot way tries to touch your kid inappropriately, and he or she immediately goes to their parent for help and is given words to help them understand it's not their fault, is given words for whatever pain comes their way, and is given a sense of safety and that you believe in them, I've never seen a kid in the 40 years or so I've been working in this field who has not done okay when that happens. I'm not saying that there can't be terrible impact. I'm not saying that there isn't at times that, as we heard, there could be lingering impact. But for the most part, what I've seen is when parents prepare kids in a non-scary way, the same way you prepare them from any of the other inevitable dangers of life, resilience is the norm. Resilience is the norm. A number of years ago, there was a bus in Long Island, Hicksville, Long Island. Preschool bus driver. He'd pull his bus up behind the local Sears every weekday morning. And he had a curtain in front of the bus, and unfortunately, he abused these preschool kids. He always came predictably late every day. He pled guilty to abusing 80 of the children, 80 children, and was convicted and sent to prison where ultimately he died. At the time, I was director of psychology in a large hospital center where we had a specialized abuse clinic, and we were responsible for the treatment of these children who he pled guilty to having been abused. And as I was seeing them together with my colleagues, something became very clear to me. Here's what became clear to me. Before they were abused, they were shown an excellent film on abuse prevention, a Disney film, that told them here's what to do if somebody touches you inappropriately. And the example was somebody who works for your school. Then I was able to show from attendance records and court records that they heard the film. They then had a lecture from a nurse, a very good lecture on abuse prevention. They then went on the bus, and I was able to show from court records they were abused. So I did a very simple study. I sat down together with some of my colleagues with every one of these kids, and I asked them in as nice a way as I could, what were you thinking? The nice nurse told you what to do. The film, the Disney film, told you what to do, but none of you disclosed. And they all looked at me like I was out of my mind. You want to know what the number one reason was that they gave for not having told? They said, tell my parents the disgusting things that Mr. Bob did to me, they'd kill me. Now, I knew these parents. I worked with them for a number of years in therapy. And they were wonderful. They were loving parents. They never talked to their kids about abuse. Who would think to talk to a 4 or 5, 6-year-old kid about abuse? Who would think about frightening them that way? But kids are kids. When an adult touched them inappropriately, they thought automatically it's my fault. It's even more so in yeshiva kids, where they're taught derech eretz. But I really believe that if you just talk to these kids, if they had known that no matter what happens, no matter what Mr. Bob tells you, because he threatened them, he's not going to come to church during choir practice and shoot your older sister, shoot your older brother. That's what abusers do sometimes. But you know something? Every single one of these kids, by the time they were finished with treatment, knew they could go to their parents. And it changed the dynamic. And they went from passive victim to victorious survivor. They named the monster. They lit up the language centers of the brain. A couple of thoughts on resilience and symptoms, because I don't think this is the part I was supposed to talk about. So I'll talk a little bit about it. How do you know if your kid's been abused? Please don't take this too seriously. There's no checklist that you know for sure. This is something that the field tells you to look for, that maybe you should have a little bit of a red flag if this is going on. Sometimes it's less obvious than this, but here's the typical set of symptoms. And I'll illustrate them with brief vignettes. Number 1, sexual behavior or knowledge unusual in a yeshiva setting. Our kids live a sheltered life. They have different levels of exposure depending on what your approach is to digital technology. I've spoken about that topic here in Baltimore a number of times. But here's the bottom line. The bottom line is, if your kid seems to know more than he or she should know, given the yeshiva they're going to, given their exposure, it means something's going on. Here's the story. It's called The Story of the Hero Rebbe. A Rebbe is teaching in a Hasidic yeshiva, Hascholas Gemara, introductory Talmud. And he comes to a piece of Gemara that has sexual content in it. He skips it, skips the Gemara. So some kid calls out, Rebbe, we know more about what's in this Gemara than you'll know in your entire lifetime. And the whole class cracks up. At this point, the Rebbe has an akudas habachira, a point of choice. He could either laugh along with them and say, who needs this, and just go along with his lesson, very tempting. Or you could do what he did. He stopped the class. He said, what are you talking about? And the kid said, Rebbe, can't you take a joke? And the whole class, come on, Rebbe, you could take a joke. You're a cool guy. Kudas habachira, point of choice. He decided, he had to make a decision. What does Viktor Frankl say? Between stimulus and response, there's a space. In that space lies our choice. In that space lies our growth. His choice was stop the class. Call the kid out. Says, what are you talking about? Why would you know about it? You're a yeshiva guy in this place. What are you talking? What do you mean you know more about me? The kid says, Rebbe, can you take a joke? And he stayed with it. And he stayed with it with the whole class. The kid showed him the janitor's closet. The janitor had gotten out of serving a 5-year prison sentence for trafficking in child pornography. They get into the janitor's closet. They find 40 videotapes. Does anybody know what a videotape is? So they used to do things on videotapes. They found 40 videos of him doing unspeakable things to these children, all the children in the class that he then trafficked on a child pornography ring. He got a very, very long prison sentence afterwards. The kids got help. And you know something? Every one of them, to my knowledge, the kav of tikva, the rope held out to them, the fact that everybody believed them and got them the right kind of help, every one of them, long term, to my knowledge, has thrived. But it all came from the hero Rebbe. A Rebbe willing to look at something in the eye that normally a person may not do. Can you imagine what he's responsible for? Saving those souls? What a schus, what an unbelievable olam haba he got. Because who knows how long it would have gone on if he hadn't done what he had done. Next, child forces sexual acts on other children. 3 questions to ask yourself in terms of kids and sexual play. What's the mood? If you come into a room and 2 5-year-old kids are playing doctor, I'll show you mine if you show me yours, that in and of itself, okay, it could be a problem, may not be a problem, but if the mood is playful, it's probably 2 kids playing doctor. Kids have been doing that for a long time. Doesn't necessarily mean they've been abused. But if you have any of the following 3 criteria, dark red flag. If the mood is angry, one of the kids is being angry with the other, force is being used, threats are being used, and also the nature of the play is playing out things the kids shouldn't know about, dark red flag. Act on it. Don't try to falsely reassure yourself. Get it checked out by a professional. Okay? That's the next thing. That's a red flag. Fear or avoidance of a specific place or person. That doesn't always mean something terrible happened, but if a kid who used to love go swimming now hates going swimming, and you can't figure out why. A kid used to love going to a certain camp, and now he or she hates going to that camp or to that after-school class, check it out. It may mean something. Change in a child's willingness to go to the mikveh, change in a kid's desire to go swimming, extreme fear and unwillingness to submit to physical examination, and then refusing to talk about a secret he or she has with an older child or an adult. Bottom line is this. If you see something that has you nervous, and as Debbie will tell you later on, if you get that gut feeling there's something off here, I don't trust that person, or there's something about what's going on with my kid that doesn't feel right, pay attention to the Bina Yisera of every woman in this room. Pay attention to it. Men, we're not so good at that stuff. Pay attention. And men, you also pay attention. We all play an incredibly important role. You have to give attention. The way we know what's going on with our children, it's to make eye contact with them. It's to face towards them, eye to eye, heart to heart, kamayim apanim el panim. Our hearts bouncing off each other. Can't be while we're looking down on our devices. When you're looking down on our devices, we don't know what's going on with our kid. It has to be by putting our devices away for a certain period of time every day and really paying attention to what's going on with them. That's the way empathy is built. It's the way a real relationship with the kid is built. Let me end with a story. My main area in the secular world is trauma, different kinds of trauma. Just like we heard, it may sound like the most depressing way to make a living in the world. It is the most energizing, meaningful way to make a living because you're constantly seeing people who are going through incredibly tough times, and you're constantly seeing the resilience of the human spirit. And the way people come back, like Sadie's kids did so soon after their liberation. So here's the final story, and I think embedded in this story is the heart of prevention before we get to Debbie. Because of my trauma stuff, I've been invited for the last number of years to Frankfurt. Every few years, companies that benefited from slave labor during the war, by German law, have to pay for a conference every few years for the remaining ever-dwindling number of survivors still alive and living in Europe, and for their therapists, mostly Jewish Russians. And it's an amazing few days to go there. You spend the day with these survivors. Most of them have absolutely no Jewish background. They've been robbed of their Jewish education by Hitler. and the Russians by communism, and just to spend a few days with them, sharing them some Jewish psychological insights. It's the most gratifying thing a person in the world could do. And it gives me hakaras hatov for what we have and we take for granted. It's an amazingly, amazingly powerful 2-3 days. Last time I went, there was a man who was such a happy man. He had such a simcha sachaim, such a joy of life, such a joie de vivre, that everybody wanted to be around him. It was catchy. It was literally contagious. Just wanted to be with him. All the survivors hung around him. I hung around him. All the therapists hung around him. He was like a superstar. He was the rock star of the Holocaust conference. He was a survivor. And I didn't know if I was going to ever see him again. He was older. And it's the last day of the conference. We're back at the hotel. We're about to take cabs back to the airport. And I go over to him and I say, look, Ma'at min ha'or docha harbe min ha'choshech. We know the little sparks of light push away a great deal of darkness. I said, I hope you don't find this disrespectful. But we've been in a lot of groups together the last 3 days. I heard how you suffered. And yet you have an unbelievable joy. I said, what's your source of light? He looked a little embarrassed. And he said, let me tell you. He's very articulate. He says, let me review with you what happened to me. I knew. It was emblazoned in my memory. And he talked about those horrible mornings, sub-freezing temperature at 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, roll call. The Nazis, Yimach Shemon, would call him and all of his fellow concentration camp inmates out into the freezing cold. If you were too slow, they'd put the dogs on you to devour you. If you fell down, you'd be machine gunned to death. And he said, and I always made it out. I was maybe 15, 16 years old, and I've often thought, what gave me the strength to make it out? And he said, and I know the answer. He says, I'll tell you what I developed. I developed the ability to feel the warmth of my father's hands on my head when he benched me every Friday night, when he gave me a bracha every Friday night, and to smell the sweetness of his breath when he bent down to kiss me. You want to know what got me through? It was that bracha. I told this story over about 1.5 years later when I was spending a couple of weeks in South Africa. I was doing some work tied to some community activism on domestic violence, on child abuse, on a couple of other things, at the invitation of the chief rabbi there. And a lot of our programs were in a beautiful mansion owned by a Jewish man who was one of the wealthiest men in the country. He lived in a magnificent mansion, unbelievable grounds, cars, a world-famous car collection, many, many, many millions of dollars of worth of cars. And I told over the story I just told you. It had not happened that long before. And I didn't know his history. He comes over to me crying after my talk. He says, David, you spent a lot of time the last couple of weeks in my house. You saw what I have, my grounds, my home. You know what my business is. You know about the cars. You know about the art. You know about who I am. He says, you know something? I'll tell you what your story got me in touch with. I would give up all of it, the house, the cars, the art, the business. He says, just for the opportunity, just once, to walk to shul, one way, I won't be a pig about it, walk to shul just once, with my mother on one side and my father on the other side, just to have that feeling of having them both on my side, walking together to shul with them. I'd give it all up for that. That's the key to abuse prevention. The key to abuse prevention is to be there for your children. The key to abuse prevention is to really be present, to let them know that no matter what happens, they could come to you. You're not going to be angry at them. That no matter what happens, you're there to protect them and to check in with them and to notice if something has changed. So with that message in our head, the message of resilience, the message of hope, the message of the power of naming the monster in order to pay attention to the tikva, to the rope of hope and community, we'll hear some more specifics in terms of strategies about abuse prevention.
do want to just respond to something that David just said. I was a teacher for 12 years before I became a social worker. And I always taught 7th and 8th grade girls. And one year, this is before I heard anything, maybe 26 or 27 years ago, and I never heard anything about sexual abuse in my life at the time. And I was teaching a 7th grade group of girls, and I was teaching Chumash. And when I was teaching Chumash, we came to one of these psukim about, as they translated it into English, she beget her, and he beget, and she beget him, and all the generations of who beget who. And I said to one of the girls, can you read that pasuk? And she looked at it, and she said, no, I can't read that. And so I went to the next girl, and I said, can you read the pasuk? And she looked at the other girl, and she said, no. And I said, is there anybody in here who would read that pasuk? And nobody would read it. I thought, this is the strangest thing. It's not even a pasuk you could not understand, right? It's not a pasuk they would be missing the words on. I said, what happened? Nobody would talk. You could feel the freeze in the room. You could just feel that freeze in the room. And I finally said to everybody, you know what? I want everybody to put your chumash down. And everybody put their chumash down. And I said, I think we need to talk about what's bothering you all. Why can't you read a pasuk about somebody giving birth to somebody else? And finally one girl said, we're not doing any more reading about this kind of thing. And it turns out they ended up disclosing to me that their science teacher would give them pornography and have them read the pornography aloud. The school was separated by boys and girls in the morning for Judaic studies, and secular studies were together. The boys and girls were together. And he would give them really pornographic things and have them read it out loud in class. And then he would do things, and you'll excuse me for saying this in a mixed setting, but he would say, okay, any girls who have your period, you have to sit up in the front row. Everybody up there, if you have your period. He would ask whose mothers were pregnant when everybody was due, and then he showed them a horrible set of videos of women having babies that were screaming. And they went on and on with the things they had been going through the entire year. This was towards the end of the year. And I asked that same question, why didn't anybody tell? One of the girls was the principal's daughter. One was the assistant principal's daughter. They were all people who could have said something, and they all said the same very typical answer, which was, we were afraid that no one would believe us. Or we were afraid we did something wrong and we'd be in trouble. And none of them told. And I told them that I needed to tell and that I promised they wouldn't be in trouble. Now, I had no background at all. I was a Chumash teacher. I had no background at all. But I went to the Menahel, and I said, I really need to talk to you, and this is what happened. This is what they said. And he kind of didn't say a whole lot. I said, you know what? It can't be he just started with this. He just came this year from a different school. Let's call and find out what happened. And we called back to the school he had been in before, and sure enough, they had fired him because of pretty much the same kind of thing. So we actually called the police together, and the police did an entire investigation. And about 2 weeks later, the police came to the school and actually took him away in handcuffs. And I will never forget the girls' reactions. They were hugging each other. They were crying in happiness. They felt so vindicated watching him being taken off in handcuffs. And I think what David was talking about is that support, that love, that being there. I think what you were stressing was hear them. Hear them. And it really wasn't great talent on my part. It really was, a moment of of understanding the right thing to do. But I think hearing them and acting and them seeing the justification was an incredibly healing experience for them. So I just want to kind of validate that point. Is it? It's working out? Okay. So I want to talk to you tonight. I want to talk to you as parents, and I want to talk to you as a community. This is my belief, is that it takes a community to create a safe environment for a child, but it also takes a community that allows abuse. And you really have what it takes here to be that community that creates a safe environment for your children. Because you've got the Rabbanim of this city who all sat together today for 3 hours and really learned intensely and walked out with this unfinished feeling, but we don't have a total action plan yet. We're not finished. We have more we need to do. You have Project CHANA who's leading. You have 5,000, how many, 3,000, 5,000? 5,000, huh? 5,000 children who are now more empowered. You have parents, 800 parents who have come in and gotten more education. You have more and more workshops. You have a lot of what it takes, and we need to continue to empower you all. Part of it is getting the environments where children are vulnerable. So remembering that children can be vulnerable in shul, remembering that before boys go to yeshiva, before boys go away to a dorm, they can be vulnerable. Fathers need to speak to every child before they go away. Every child needs to be spoken to. I know that in one community I went to, I sat and I said to the fathers, you all need to speak to your children about personal safety, and I mimicked a conversation. And one father raised my hand, and he raised his hand and he said, I can just see it. I'm going to sit and say to my son, if anybody touches you, then you have to say no, and then you have to call me, and you have to tell me. He's like, do you want to watch me roll my eyes the way he's going to roll his eyes when I talk to him? I said, is that going to stop you from doing what would be helpful to him? Because he might roll his eyes? Because he might make fun of you? Do you not do what you need to do because he might make fun of you? And then after Yom Kippur, he called me. And he said, I need to thank you. I need to thank you because on Yom Kippur night, I did have the conversation. He said, I rolled my eyes at you, and then I had the conversation anyway. And on Yom Kippur night in the yeshiva, in most yeshiva dorms today, they have to have 3 boys. They don't allow only 2 boys anymore for good reason. It's 3 boys in a room. But right before Yom Kippur, one of the boys in his son's room got very sick and went home. His son was out of town, but the other 2 boys were in town. So one of the boys went home, and there were only 2, and nobody realized it because it happened suddenly. And Yom Kippur night, the other boy came, and he was deeply asleep, and the other boy ripped off his sheets and began to touch him. And he yelled, no! And he got up, and he ran, which is just what we told his father to do. No, run, and tell. And he didn't know what to do, because he ran out of the room. But you know what happens when you're in a dorm in the middle of the night? All you see are doors closed. He can't walk into someone else's room in the middle of the night. He was in his pajamas with no shoes on. He walked down the hall, and at the end of the hall and down the stairs was the beis medrash, and that was the only room he could find a seat in. So he went to the beis medrash at the middle of the night and sat down, and he fell asleep. And in the morning, the first one into the beis medrash was his Rebbe. And his Rebbe came over to him and was wonderful and heard him, and he said, I'm going to take care of you. You did the right thing. And they actually ended up taking care of issues related to this other boy. And immediately after Yom Kippur, he called home on his father's cell. This boy apparently was a bit of a mama's boy, and he had never called his father on his father's cell. He always called the house phone and spoke to his mother first, and then the mother said, okay, you want to say hi to Tati? You know those calls? So he said he called on his father's cell, and he said, Tati, I have to talk to you. And his father said, okay. He said, you know that you said that if something happens, I have to tell? Well, I'm telling. And it was that he knew what to do, and he knew how to get help. So if you know the situations and you deal with them by conversations, then that's what empowers you as parents to develop those relationships with children and to communicate with them that which they need. Seminaries. I think until a few years ago, girls' parents would never have thought of talking about inappropriate touch with their daughters in seminaries. That has to be a common conversation that every parent has to have with their children before they go to seminary, with their girls. Has to do with inappropriate relationships and inappropriate touch in seminary as well. Day school. Your own home, and we're going to talk about that. Because whereas statistics I had been reading said something to the effect of 68 to 75% of sexual abuse happened in the home, David just said today that it's about 90 in the Frum community. That's about 90%. That means we have to talk about that. And then lastly, of course, is summer camp. And one thing I said this morning is when I started this work over 20 years ago or so, however many years ago, and my own kids were like, oh, Mom, that never happens. I don't know what you're doing, that kind of talk. And I said something about, well, we're talking about this, and we're talking about that, and we're talking about summer camp. And they're like, oh, summer camp. Yeah, no, that happens to everybody in summer camp, right? That happens to everybody in one way or another. So in each of these, we're going to talk about camp in a few minutes, but you need to be aware that these are areas where children are vulnerable, because if you can have those natural discussions, just like Dr. Pelkowitz said, that's what's going to empower you. So I'm starting off by saying, okay, Baltimore, okay, here we are, here you all are together, and are you that community that creates a safe environment for children because it takes all of you together? And so what can you do as that empowered parent? I found this and I thought it was amazing. If you're too afraid to talk about child sexual abuse before it happens, you may only get to talk about it after. That's not what you want. You want to talk about it before your own way. So what's your role? The 3 things we're going to talk about tonight is talk to your children, be advocates, and when you see something, say something. Those are the 3 basic things we're going to talk about. Fewer than 30% of parents have ever discussed sexual abuse prevention with their children. And I think we would all agree that these conversations are the best tool you have to prevent your children from being abused. I wrote down secret weapon is peanut butter and jelly. And that's how I say things that were very similar to what Dr. Pelkowitz said. I call it your peanut butter and jelly voice. I think when I was here before I discussed it also, but I call it your peanut butter and jelly voice, which means the way you would say to your child, would you like a cream cheese sandwich or a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? Which one would you prefer? There's calm to that. There's no intensity to that. There's no fear to that. There's no discomfort to that. If I say, you're going to go to camp soon and there's some things we have to talk about, like, like not letting anybody touch you in camp or anything. We have to sit down and have that talk, They catch your discomfort. So you need to even practice saying things in a voice that lets your kids know, I'm really natural about this. I'm really natural about this. And just like I'm natural about it, you can be natural with me. You can talk to me just like I can talk to you. I call that the secret weapon, is a peanut butter and jelly voice, is being able to be very, very calm and very natural so that you can talk naturally, they can ask you questions, and you as well, and they can as well talk to you in that same natural voice. So we're going to go through a series of conversations, and I'm going to go through them rather quickly, but I want you to be able to kind of gather the tone and maybe some language to have some of these conversations, because that is your biggest prevention. And I'm going to say that when I go around the country and speak, I very often give an evaluation form. And one of the things that I will write is what did you learn that you benefited from most? And almost everybody I get so many that say the peanut butter and jelly voice and conversations. They want to know the words. What do I say? And so that's why Shmuel asked me, give them what they need. Just tell them in the end what they need. Give them the punch, tell them what they need. And I'm going to say this is what you need. You just need the language, and you need that comfort with saying it. And I want you to listen to my almost boring way of saying it over and over so that you can gather that and utilize that as well. So you walk into a room, and like Dr. Pelkovitz said, children are very naturally playing doctor. There's a very calm atmosphere, and you walk in, and they're like, oops, we got caught, that kind of thing. So when you see that, you might ask them, what game are you playing? Has anybody else played that game with you? You might ask those questions, but the first thing you would do is just say, hey kids, we have to remember the rules. We don't play games with the private parts of the body. So the first thing we're going to do is get dressed. I want you guys to get dressed. And then we're going to go into the kitchen, and I'm going to give you some cookies and some milk, and we'll sit down and talk about it. So the first thing you want to make sure is they have their clothes back on. You take them down, and you review the rules with them, right? So the rules are, just remember that the rules are that there's no touching, talking about, or looking at the private areas of your body. Is playing games with your private parts ever okay? It's never okay to play doctor with your private parts. Do you want to play doctor? You can play doctor. We can play doctor, look in your nose and your ears and your elbows and your toes, and we can give medicine and we can look in your throat. It's okay to play doctor. But touching your private parts is never a game. So from now on, when you want to play doctor, we don't play doctor with the private parts, okay? Because that's never a game. What if someone wanted to play that game with you and said that it was a secret? Is that okay? No, because touching private parts is never a game and it's never a secret. I brought a bunch of magnetiles in here, and you guys can stay in here, and there's cookies and milk, and you can play magnetiles. And you move on. So you've concretized your conversation. They learn the rule. Nobody was in trouble, and you move on. I'm not going to go into what David went into, which is in situations where you might be concerned. I'm going to just discuss the natural conversations today. Okay? Let's talk about your older kids. When kids maybe starting at 7, when you start talking to them about their body, 6, 7, we teach this all the way even to younger kids, but a conversation you might have, and you always want to find a natural place, a natural time, a window of opportunity to have it with them. So you don't want to have a conversation with them by telling them you're going to sit down and have that talk, right? So it might be, children are about to go away to camp. It might be that they're going to a sleepover. It might be any of these kinds of natural situations where what you would say is your body belongs to you, and absolutely everybody has to respect that your body belongs to you. So let me ask you something. When Uncle Yankee comes over, then can Uncle Yankee touch your body or look at you? No, he can't. Could your brother touch you or look at your body? Nope, your brother couldn't. Could your friend Malky come? Could she touch your body? No, Malky couldn't. Could a Rebbe in your school touch your body? No. Nobody can touch your body because your body belongs to you and you're the boss, right? So touching, talking, or looking at the private areas of your body is never a game, and it's never a secret. And you're the boss, and everybody has to respect that. So if anybody, even at home, wants to touch, look at, or talk about the private areas of your body, or wants you to touch, look at, or talk about the private areas of their body, I want you to tell me immediately. Or really what you're going to really let them know is If anybody wants to touch them, you want them to say no, to run away and to tell you. And anytime they're even uncomfortable with someone, like someone is looking at them funny or talking to them funny or they don't feel comfortable with the conversation, you want them to say no and come and tell you, to go away, remove themselves, and to come and tell you, no matter who it is that you want to know and you want to hear, that you're their parent, that if anybody makes them uncomfortable, wants them to touch you, or wants you to touch them, that in any of those situations that you want them to talk to you because you're their parent, and you'll believe them and protect them, and no matter what happened or who it happened with, that you're there for them. There's nobody that can open that conversation with them but you. Your child is not going to open the conversation. You have to be the one that's going to educate them. I'm going to basically just kind of say, when your child goes to sleepovers, I know sleepovers are a major area of concern for parents today. And I can tell you from my private practice that a lot of games really happen at sleepovers, both for boys and for girls. And a lot of inappropriate things happen at sleepovers in terms of pictures, in terms of videos, in terms of things they're seeing, in terms of games they're playing, in terms of changing times, in terms of conversations that are happening. And as parents, there's certain things you need to do. Number one, review those rules of safety. Number two, before your child goes, do you feel safe with your child going to that house? Do you know if there's going to be supervision? You want to go over all of that with them. You want to make sure before they go that there is supervision at that house. You want to make sure your child's comfortable with every member of the family, doesn't have any feeling of being uncomfortable with her brothers or her father or a parent, whatever. You want to make sure your child's comfortable. And if your child really isn't comfortable or you're not comfortable, make the sleepover at your house. If you have an uncomfortable feeling or they have an uncomfortable feeling, respect it. Okay, you make sure they don't. But go over things with them. Doors shouldn't be locked. That if they're uncomfortable with anybody, they should have the sleepover at home. No pranks or bullying type behavior. And the thing that I always stress also is that it's important for families to have an internal password. That if a child ever feels like something's going on they're not comfortable with, safe with, or if any touching kinds of things or viewing things is going on that they're not comfortable with, they should call you and say that password, and no matter what, you'll come. Just come get them, no questions asked. The reason we really started to develop this is because what kids said to us is, right, so what am I going to do? Mom, could you come get me? Because everybody's here is looking on their phone at this pornographic stuff, so do you think you could come get me? Would anybody say that in front of their friends? Nobody would. Nobody would. It would be too embarrassing to say something like that. If they said, Mom, I have one of those headaches, would that be a more natural way to say, I need help now? If that's your family passcode, that is a way for you to come. And I know that in one of these camp issues that happened a couple of years ago, did you remember this 2 or 3 years ago in the summer? A boy witnessed a counselor in bed with another boy, and in the middle of the night he got up and he went, called his parents, said the password, hung up the phone, and the parents were there in the morning. So I do believe that these passwords are important. There's a sensitive discussion that people have to have with their children, and I think really this is a discussion for fathers, probably even more so than mothers, though I think it's important. And that's that you really need to be able to talk to your sons about not touching others, most important, including their sisters or cousins, because the statistics are quite high, and I think that from mental health professional you'll talk to will say that one of the most concerning statistics we have, and this is what you said also in your practice you're seeing, is that there's a very concerning statistic about how much sexual abuse, up to 90%, that's happening in the home. So we need to talk about not only nobody touching you, but if it's happening in the home, that means someone else in the family is touching. So you need to have that preventive talk. And it might go something like this. I'm really glad we've had that ability to discuss rules related to your personal safety. And it's my way as your parent to help you feel safe. But there's another aspect of personal safety we have to talk about too. And just like no one's allowed to touch you or talk about your private parts or look at your private parts, you also aren't allowed to touch, look at, or talk about anybody else's private parts. And I know that sometimes maybe kids might be curious, and maybe they would feel a need to touch a sister or a brother or a cousin or even a friend. But you're never allowed to touch another person's private parts or ask them to touch yours or look at them. So I know it's hard to talk about. It's sensitive and it's kind of hard to talk about. It's even uncomfortable for me to talk about it. But the reason it's so important is because sometimes it happens. And sometimes children do initiate touching or exposing themselves or asking someone else to touch them. So sometimes it may seem like a game, and other times they may want to force other children. And it can happen. So I need you to clearly know this is against the rules of safety. And I need you to clearly know that if ever this is a concern for you, come talk to me, because then I'm going to help you to make sure this doesn't happen. And it's amazing, since we've been telling parents to say this, we had one boy who came forward to his parents and said that he was exposing himself. In the evening, he would go out and expose himself to women who were going into stores, shopping, from stores. He would expose himself. And he said to his parents, I daven every night. I say, Hashem, please don't make me have a taiva to do that. I know it's a terrible thing, but then it happens. And the next day I do it again. And he was able to tell his parents after they had this discussion and to get help. There was another story where a parent had said this, and then his son went away to yeshiva. He had an off Shabbos. He came home. The father had said, if anything ever happens, you can talk to me any time. I will always be there for you. You can always tell me. And at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Friday night, his father has a knock on the door, and the son says, what? He's sleeping. And the son says, Tati, I need to talk to you. And you said you would be there any time. And so the father opens the door. He puts on his robe. He opens the door. He goes out. They sit down on the couch together, and he says, what? What happened? And the son says, Tati, I just touched my sister, and it's not the first time. And his father described something amazing. He said, with my right hand, I wanted to strangle him for violating my daughter. And with my left hand, I hugged him and said, I love you, and I'm going to get you the help you need. And that's a feeling nobody ever wants to have, because you're talking about the offender being your son and the victim your daughter. So that's why these conversations with your children are so important. I'm just going to say, before camp, you need to have those discussions again. No means no. Don't engage in bullying behaviors. Talk to your children about changing times. Talk to them about who in camp you could talk to if ever you were in an uncomfortable situation. And really briefly, and I'm not going to go into this right now because this isn't kind of the time and place, but along with these conversations, and maybe, Shmuel, I would encourage that this be maybe the next type of thing that you have maybe, would be you have to bring up to your children and start talking about puberty and start talking about the birds and bees and intimacy and sexuality. Because as Dr. Nagel in Los Angeles, who's a wonderful pediatrician, always says, who's better than you, the parent? Do you really want them learning this from the other kids? Because they are. If you don't teach it to them your way, they don't get your approach. So we want you to learn how to talk to your parents about it. It's just one more way for you to help prevent a lot of unhealthy things in their life. So I would encourage you to think about that. 5 minutes? Oh, okay, good. Okay, so I'm going to really quickly go into this. Is easy. Advocacy, it's not only that you be doing you have these conversations. But that next piece is advocacy. As parents advocate, ask schools if they have policies. Ask camps, do you have a policy? Do you have a policy where you train your counselors and all of that? When you think of programs, speak to Project CHANA, speak to people here. If you see things happening in your community, speak up, because those are ways for you as parents to be active. If you see things of concern, speak up. And in terms of people who are here from institutions, it's really the same. It's advocacy. It's doing the kinds of things we talked about this morning with Rabbanim. It's making sure that whatever your institution is, that that the safety of children is a priority, and that your institution is safe for children and not for predators. That you are aware of, that you have policies, and that you make sure that your children are a priority, and that it means background checks, reference checks, interviews with all your employees, clear guidelines, clear boundaries, that you, as those of you who are in leadership positions, you also have to take responsibility. If you see any infraction of a rule, you need to say something. I'll give you a very quick example of that. A principal told me in a school that every morning the boys after davening would go over and they would say, good morning, and they would shake, or shalom aleichem, they would shake a Rebbe's hand. And he was very comfortable with it. It was a very nice thing, right? It was just fine. He said, but he noticed every morning, and he went every morning on the side and he watched it, that when one boy went, he shook his hand, he said good morning, or shalom aleichem, or whatever, and he was fine, he was comfortable, he thought it was lovely. In the base medrash, in front of everybody. But he noticed that every morning one boy, he took two hands, he shook his hands, and he pulled him close and hugged him, and then he moved on. And I said to him, why are you telling me? You're the principal. You see something that doesn't look comfortable, you tell him. So if you're in a leadership role and something doesn't look right, you supervise. Don't be afraid. This is putting the kids as a priority. This last point is, if you see something, say something. Anything that you see that is of concern, go to the right people and say something. And working together, all of you like that together, that is going to make you a safe environment for children. And I really believe, and I see even in just this year, how Baltimore has that ability. And I really applaud you all for taking the seriousness of it.
Okay, thank you to our presenters. We now will just have a couple minutes where I'm going to welcome Rabbi Howard to share a few closing words with us.
I want to express all of our gratitude first of all, to CHANA and to Shmuel Fischler for all the work that they did to create this day and this very, very important evening, to our panelists, to Dr. Pelkowitz, to Lisa Ferentz, to Debbie Fox for coming and providing such an enlightening evening for us and a very, very important evening for us. I have a Haggadah at home that I use still pretty much. I got it in first grade. I like to use it, at least one of the Haggadahs. It brings back good memories. And it has illustrations in it. And when you get to the page with the four sons, it has a picture where it portrays the wise son and the wicked son, all the way you could imagine. And then it has the son that's she'eno yodea lishol, that's unable to ask. And he's portrayed as a very small child. And he has his finger, like in his mouth. Like somehow he's lacking in some kind of intelligence. And that's the picture which I grew up with of the she'eno yodea lishol, of the one who's not able to ask. But as time went on, I realized that very often the she'eno yodea lishol is not lacking in intelligence. They don't know how to ask because they don't know that it's something that they can ask about. They don't know that there's something that can be discussed, that's on the table, that's able to be brought up. And one major goal accomplish tonight, we don't solve the world in this terribly, terribly difficult problem, is that we make all of us, those present here and those who aren't here, those who will watch the video and those who won't, but will just have seen the flyer, will know that you can ask. You can bring it up. It's something to speak about. And to each of us, whether our role is as parents, as friends, as rabbis, as teachers, the other aspect of knowing how to ask, or knowing how to ask, being able to ask, is that not only is the subject able to be broached, but someone's going to be there to listen. And our task as parents, as friends, as teachers, as rabbis, as any of these things, is to be eminently approachable, so that our children, the people around us, our adults, know that the door is open. You know, Rashi writes in the beginning of the Chumash that this world was created with the letter Hey, and the letter Hey has a big opening in it, because this world is very imperfect, and it has to have psachim, it has to have doors, it has to have openings where you can go to somehow find some level of resolution, some way to address these tremendous imperfections. I am grateful again for what we did here tonight, and I'm grateful to others who were involved. I would like to also single out, I hope it's okay, but Larry Ziffer, I know, was very, very involved in creating today and tonight. And to thank you for coming, and for all of you, everyone who came here, and may, God willing, today just be a day to making our community and all the members of our community a healthier and stronger place. Thank you for coming.